Now, you're obviously, I don't know if you can correct me if you've been influenced by Hebrew roots. You believe that if you're a Jew by ethnicity, a Jewish Christian, you should be following the Torah of Moses. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Right. Now, just to be clear, just as a disclaimer, because Restoration Fellowship, obviously founded by Anthony Buzzard was in the Armstrong movement, which was a Sabbatarian system, unfortunately for him. So he's obviously written a lot against any type of Sabbatarianism. Just tell our viewers how you came into that understanding and what form of it do you follow? Because as you know, different Christian groups like SDAs and so on, they're big on certain parts of Torah, like the food laws and so on. Most Sabbatarians, I believe, they keep Sabbath. And most Sabbatarians, as far as I know, are not into physical circumcision. So they have spiritualized many things. So how did you come into this understanding, and what type of Sabbatarianism, as we know it, if any, do you practice and do you teach?
Yeah, I'm not Sabbatarian. I used to be. I was Reformed Presbyterian, and the Reformed Presbyterian view on the law is actually not that far from Messianic Jewish views on the law. There's some important differences. They keep the Sabbath on a different day, right? For Presbyterians, Sunday is the new Sabbath. There's a change that the Bible authors forgot to include. But that's the view. And sort of a very strict, keeping of the Sabbath on Sunday. So I did that. My wife and I did that together for some time, and certainly have regrets about it now. I no longer believe that it's biblical, and so it's when you look back on that and you're like, I could have, I missed some things on Sundays that I wish I hadn't missed if I had known that wasn't required of me. But it was important to stick to our principles and do what we could do with our conscience at that time. So yeah, basically just the Presbyterian view of the law is again very similar to the Messianic Jewish view, and once I got away from that, I got away from Sabbatarianism. My view as far as the two-track sort of system, as you call it, is just that Jews were keeping the Mosaic law, I think, when Jesus came. I mean, they were told to. You read the end of the Old Testament, and kind of the last thing that you get there is, hey, make sure you're keeping the Mosaic law, And when Jesus comes, I think he kept the Mosaic law. I remember your presentation. I know we're probably not in agreement on that, but I do interpret it that he kept the law, and I think that the apostles were. And so when you get to Acts 15, especially, I think you see, you have this question come along. Well, now we have Gentile converts. Do they need to be circumcised and keep the law? And the answer is no. So definitely Gentiles don't need to. But in my mind, it's like, doesn't the fact that question could be asked and there could be that controversy in itself show you that Jews were doing it? Because if they had already said, well, Jesus came and told us we don't need to keep the law anymore, nobody's going to say, well, should the Gentiles keep it too, right? They're not going to look at the Gentiles and be like, well, we're not keeping it, but maybe they should, right? They wouldn't do that. It only makes sense in the context of that they were keeping the law themselves and hadn't yet stopped doing that. You can make an argument, maybe they were supposed to have stopped doing it and they just hadn't, but I think it's hard to argue with the fact that they were still keeping it then, whether that was right or wrong of them. So that's basically where I get the two tracks idea from, and you combine that with Acts 21, and it seems like it's been a few years and nothing has changed. James quotes Acts 15's decision, and you read about many Jews who are zealous for the law, and Paul seems to say that he keeps the law there. I mean, I know that's a debated passage, I guess, but my reading of it is that basically they say, Paul, there's this rumor that you don't keep the law and that you're teaching Jews not to keep the law. What are we going to do? We know that's not true. Here's what you do. You take some sacrifices and you go offer them for this vow that you were under, pay for other people to do it so that they can see that you're encouraging other Jewish Christians to keep the law as well. And then everybody will know that there's nothing to these rumors. Remember, we said that the Gentiles don't need to do this, and then he quotes Acts 15, but the Jews seemingly were. And then this to me is really important in my own thinking, at least, just that if Paul had not really been keeping the law, this would have been the perfect place for Paul to have taken a stand and said, hey, no, you guys are getting it wrong. Let's get back to what Jesus taught, if Jesus taught this, or let's get back to whatever was revealed after he ascended, if you're going to view this change as something that happened after Jesus ascended. Gentiles don't need to keep the law, but neither do we. It would have been the perfect place to have said that and to have made a stand for that if that were what he really believed. But he just goes along with it. And they say, by doing this action, you're telling people that you're keeping the law. And he does it. And so to me, that just seems like he's intentionally saying, the rumors are false. I do actually keep the law, and I do teach Jews to do it. And it's always been difficult for me because it seems like the only response that I get from people when I brought this point up to people who say that Paul didn't keep the law is that like Paul was being dishonest or something. And I don't buy that. I mean, do we really think Paul was being dishonest?
I think, to be fair to us, I think the word that has been used about that behavior from Paul is diplomacy. What do you say to that? No, it's about diplomacy. Maybe as good a time as that looked to us to be, Acts 21, let's say, as an example, Paul knows better and he was just being diplomatic. What do you say to the diplomacy card?
I have a hard time with it because Paul is making a statement by doing that, right? James sets it up. James and the elders, they set it up and they say, you're making a statement that these rumors are false and that you do keep the law. And so I can understand being shrewd and wanting to do things in a diplomatic way, not showing all your cards, right? I can understand that, but it's hard to see making a statement like that as just diplomacy if that statement wouldn't be true.
The reason most of us bring up the diplomacy card, let's call it, is because of passages we find in Paul himself like this. This is a famous one, 1 Corinthians 9. For although I'm free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all so that I might win more of them. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. That's weird for a Torah observant Paul to say, if he was Torah observant, in order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. Now, obviously, we can read between the lines here, the law of Moses. This is pretty much where the diplomacy card, if you will, comes from, this sort of testimony from Paul himself. What do you make of passages like this?
I think it's a hard passage. I mean, I just want to preface it by saying I think the whole issue is a hard issue in some respect, right? Because you do sort of have an apparent contradiction, I would argue. I think that you have an apparent contradiction. And mind you, I'm not saying a real contradiction, but where it looks like there's something of a contradiction between the testimony of Acts and between the testimony of Paul's letters. And so I think the real area where not everybody's agreeing with each other here isn't that one of us doesn't believe part of the Bible or something, right? We're just all trying to reconcile one biblical text with another, and we're doing that in different ways sometimes. And so for me, I look at passages like that, and I do want to look into that more. Like we said before the interview when we chatted, it's something that I think it's a good question and it deserves good answers, and I don't think that I have great answers for it right now.
Is this the same when it comes to classic passages like Colossians 2:16 and 17, where Paul once again is very critical? We believe the standard reading, even, this is something actually many non-Trinitarians like myself wholeheartedly agree with evangelicals on, that Paul was obviously not under the law of Moses. So is that something you also need to look into, or do you already have a formulated counter to this?
I think one way that you could reconcile that, I mean, again, this is reconciling text, right? If you want to kind of say, we think that Acts gives us the two-track paradigm, that Jews are keeping the law and Gentiles don't need to, then you've got to reconcile that with the hard statements in Paul's letters where he seems to say otherwise, which, by the way, would fit with the Acts narrative that says there's this rumor that Paul was teaching against the law. Obviously, somebody in the first century got the idea that Paul was teaching against the law. But the question is, did Paul deny that or affirm that? And I think it looks like he denies that was true. But with the Colossians passage you brought up, I think...
that's a fascinating passage, Acts 21. I have looked into it. I'm continue to look into it. I'm still not persuaded with your view, but nonetheless, just a quick question, then back to Colossians. So do you believe the charges brought on by James, reflecting the wider Jewish community, the myriads, that's a Greek word meaning maybe tens of thousands,
right.
Might be an exaggeration on the part of the historian Luke there. Do you believe the charges in Acts 21 had validity? In other words, was it based on truth or some element of truth that Paul was in apostasy is the Greek, I believe there? You're teaching apostasy against Moses? Or do you think they were, as we say nowadays, trumped up charges against Paul.
Yeah, I think they were trumped up charges, and my reason for that is mainly the response of Paul and James and the elders there. James and the elders, they walk into it assuming it's a trumped up charge, right? They say, Paul, we know this is false, so here's what you'll do to show everybody that it's false. And again, just the fact that Paul agrees with them, Paul does what they say, and he, I think it's set up again that he's making a statement by that action. I think we basically have Paul commenting on that rumor there, saying, the rumor's false. I didn't do it.
So now Colossians 2, you wanted to expound on a little?
Yeah, Colossians 2, I mean, for a long time I've just, even when I was, kind of on the fence, I just don't see it as really a home run for the view that would say Paul didn't teach law observance, because he's writing mainly to Gentiles in Colossians, I think. That's a Greek city. And saying, let nobody be your judge in regard to food and drink and new moons and Sabbaths, right? That's talking about the Mosaic institutions, definitely. But if you're just saying to Gentiles, don't let people judge you in respect to this stuff, that definitely implies, hey, you Gentiles don't need to do this stuff, or it would be appropriate for people to judge you, right? Within the church, we are to judge. We are to have church discipline, I believe. We are to uphold a certain standard of holiness for Christians, right? And so the fact that he says, don't let anybody be your judge in regards to that stuff, says that's not part of that standard of holiness for the church of Colossae that he's writing to. I'm just not totally convinced that means that Jewish Christians weren't doing it, though, especially if he's writing primarily to Gentiles. And it could also even just be more of a matter of, how you're interpreting the law, kind of like we know that the Jewish Christians there will be interpreting the law, but you're not under some sort of particular interpretation of it. Like the guy next to you doesn't get to tell you, it means this, you have to interpret it this way. You're free to interpret it more freely. Because we know that interpretation of the law was also a huge, huge issue, right? You think of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the oral law and a million different schools of interpretation. So you think of how heated those disputes got among the non-believing Jews. Potentially part of it could be kind of like saying, hey, don't let that be the case among Christians. We're not going to have a bunch of different competing, fighting schools of interpretation. Just let nobody else be your judge in regard to it. You interpret it as you see fit with your own conscience and your own understanding. That's one way you could read it.
One of the things I find fascinating about the Sabbatarian system as a whole, I think the majority of Sabbatarians are not for physical circumcision, although they keep, like I said, forms of the Old Covenant Torah of Moses, specifically food laws, and the Sabbath day, Saturday. Maybe correct me if you have looked into this more. They don't advocate physical circumcision. In other words, they, in my mind, have been forced to accept that the letters of Paul is not teaching circumcision. He's teaching this spiritual circumcision, right? Is that your view, that because circumcision, I call it the gateway to Torah keeping, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's the whole debate in Acts 15.
Oh, yeah.
I think even Sabbatarians have had to accept the fact that, oh no, there's no longer physical circumcision. That's been spiritualized. Do you see it that way too, or do you believe Paul was also teaching? Well, we see it with Timothy in Acts, enforcing circumcision.
I agree with you that law keeping and circumcision go hand in hand. I think that's really hard to get around biblically. In the book of Acts, law keeping and circumcision go together, right? When there's the question of Gentiles and the law in Acts 15, it's specifically, do Gentiles need to be circumcised and keep the law? They're not separated from each other. The same is true in Acts 21. The rumor against Paul is that he's teaching Jews to not circumcise their children and keep the law. So again, we see them paired. So I definitely think you're correct in saying it's a gateway to law keeping. I'm not familiar with the people who don't think that they should circumcise. I do think that seems like a gross inconsistency. Maybe I just haven't heard the arguments for it, but to me, it seems like if you're going to say that people should still be keeping the Mosaic law, particularly those who are members of national ethnic Israel rather than Gentiles, then circumcision would have to go with that if you're going to be consistent.
So Colossians, you say he's writing only to Gentiles, most likely?
That was one suggestion, and the other was that if it did apply to Jews, it could just be viewed in terms of, not having some sort of authoritative oral interpretation of the law.
Yeah, because I was going to say that in Galatians 4, which is similar to the Colossians 2, as you know, where he says you are observing days, months, seasons. He includes himself. Now, you could say, I guess, maybe, I don't know, in a figurative way, he's saying we as a royal. What do you make of that parts of Paul where he says, for example, in Galatians 4, in the same way we also, when we were not of age, were enslaved to the elemental powers of this world. And it sounds like later on, like I said in verse 10, he alludes to the Jewish calendar. Do you think that's a fair reading, or do you have a different?
I'm not familiar enough with it to really want to be able to say, the law issue was something that I worked through before I worked through the Trinity. So when I was a freshman in college, I worked through this and sort of arrived at the two tracks view and sort of came back to it after leaving Presbyterianism. But it's not something that I've dove into in a lot of depth recently, right? The Trinity has been the main focus for so long. So a lot of the relevant passages like this, I'm just not as...
Right.
I looked at it at one time and had my thinking on it, but I don't really remember exactly what it is now. So I don't have a real answer for you.
So presently you believe, let's say you're in a church that believes that way. So if you have Jewish members in this church group, practically speaking, how would that look? Because if, let's say, half of your church is Jewish and they're supposed to be under still the law of Moses, they should be circumcising themselves, their children.
Mm-hmm.
It seems sort of, I don't know if the word's unworkable, because then you have different days of worship, right? Because the Gentile section is used to the Sunday as the resurrection day. And then you have the issue of communion, which Passover obviously is once a year. It's not whenever, as often as right as we interpret it. So how would that church at present, you believe that's workable, or how is that?
I think it could be. I think it's a great question. I mean, I think that, to me, as somebody who likes the church fathers, I look at the early church and see sort of an answer to the first question, maybe, where I think that the way I read the evidence, especially concerning like the Nazarenes and the Jews who kept the law for several centuries after Christ but believed in Christ, is the testimony that we have about them is that they were Christians, they believed in Jesus, and that meant that they worshipped together with the Gentiles on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week. So they did worship on Sunday, but it also meant that they kept the Sabbath on Saturday and met with the Jews until they were kicked out. Obviously, nowadays and for a long time, most Jewish synagogues wouldn't allow someone who believes Jesus is the Messiah to partake in their meeting. But to whatever extent that would be possible, keeping the Sabbath on Saturday and then still meeting with Christians on Sunday, sort of just how I would imagine it. Again, really just looking at the early Nazarenes and how they tried to handle that as sort of a pattern. As far as Passover, I think that if you're viewing Passover and communion as one and the same thing, then that poses a real difficulty. I've sort of taken it as that they're not the same thing. I know in the early church, my understanding is that they had communion weekly, so there was a weekly Eucharist celebration.
The Gentile section of the church had a weekly communion service.
I'd be inclined to see it as probably both sections. I think this was something that was done on the Lord's Day. So if what I just said about Jewish Christians meeting with Gentile Christians on the Lord's Day were true, then I think that you'd have everybody partaking of communion every week. But then you would also have some kind of an annual celebration of Pascha for the Jewish Christians. And I actually think that Gentile Christians did that too. I think that Jews and Gentiles in the early church celebrated Pascha. Again, this is actually less out of exegetical reasons, although I do think there are exegetical reasons to think this, and more out of history. Just knowing the early church fathers, there was a very primitive sort of church calendar early on. It looks nothing like the Roman Catholic calendar. The only two things that I think you can really firmly identify are Pascha and Pentecost. And so there's this idea that early on, Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians were having some sort of annual celebration of the Pascha as a memorial. They didn't have the temple; they wouldn't be offering animal sacrifices, at least the Gentile ones, and even the Jews couldn't without the temple. And there was some sort of annual commemoration that happened every year. Again, you see that in the church fathers. You have people like Melito of Sardis, who's not Jewish, and he writes about Pascha and everything.
I thought the so-called church fathers were antinomian, even to the point of early anti-Semitic sentiments.
Yeah, I think most of them were definitely very against keeping the Mosaic law, which is why I think that there's sort of you can make an argument here for sort of an apostolic church calendar that's not that has carryovers from the Mosaic law that are kind of, not necessarily tied to the law. So you've got Gentiles celebrating Pascha, but they're not doing it necessarily as part of keeping the Mosaic law. But you've also got Jewish believers who are keeping it as part of the Mosaic law. I really think that some of them get a harsher rap for being anti-Semitic than they deserve to. I think that sometimes what gets taken as anti-Semitic is just being critical of their non-acceptance of Jesus as the Messiah, that sort of thing. It's no more anti-Semitic, quote unquote, in the New Testament in that respect.